Hi everyone. Thank you very much for joining us to the fourth ArchiTalk now. We are very pleased to have Andrew Howe here today. Andrew is a strategic thinker who brings together finely tuned technical skills and delivery experience, enabling creative ideas to land in practical execution. This experience comes from over 3 decades of design with state government development agencies, 4 years in Sydney for a consulting firm, and for the past 25 years with Element, where he has been part of the leadership team that has grown the business from 3 people to the 45 people it employs today. That's fantastic. His depth of knowledge around commercial drivers, persistent yet practical approach, ability to think on his feet, and commitment to working authentically with local communities has enabled him to break new ground in areas such as developing planning controls, raising urban design standards, and embedding placemaking principles into management of billion-dollar assets. Into the future, Andrew sees the planners and designers will need to more deliberately orient thinking toward new drivers for commercial activity and employment generations as the internet and automation continues to shake up life as we know it. Thank you very much. Let's just welcome Andrew Howe from Element.
Thanks very much. This is a slightly misleading title. It's a bit of a discussion, I suppose, about a number of things, probably best described by that. So I am an urban designer, finished here in '86, so these halls are all very familiar, they haven't changed much. And then sort of ended up in urban design. And I'm also from the country, so for one reason or other, I've always ended up doing a lot of regional projects as well, in all sorts of different styles and things. And I hope at the end of this, what I hope is that next time you go to the country, you have a slightly different look and a slightly different view of what you're seeing in the towns, because I think we've got some real challenges. I mean, I gather Peter Lee last week, or whenever he spoke, was about disruption with technology and how it's affecting his industry. Well, disruption in technology is affecting everything all the time. It's not something that's coming. It's been here for a long time, and particularly within the regions. So I'd like to talk to you about how I use and see urban design, and it's not just about pavement and trees. When to use urban design, and then I suppose how to use it, and particularly in the regions. But more importantly, how do the regions need help with it? How we can't just race in there and give them a main street the way we might out at Bayswater. It's a completely different response. And so how for you is going forward in your design careers, you might be able to think about how you can apply design to the regions, because it's quite different. And what the learnings are that I've had over the years, I suppose. Now, this is to give you an idea about how random this talk is. One of the reasons I see urban design is I see it as well done. It's basically a user interface for humans and a city or an urban place. Cities are the most complex things that man has created in history. You know, we talk about computers and all the rest of it, but if you look at a city of 20 million people, the moving parts in that are infinitesimal. And as a result, our ability to interpret a space and understand it intrinsically is often challenged. And so really a good urban designer has to create that user interface. This is the first map of the London Underground. This is 1903 or 1908. And what it did was they put all the rail routes literally geographically exactly where they were underground and under roads and the spacious. What customers couldn't work out actually was where to change trains, and they didn't really care how long they were underground because there's no windows or anything anyway. And they didn't really care what they were going under, the way you might if you're in a car or something, you're going past it, to orient yourself. So people found that very confusing, even though it was an accurate map. And there was a guy called Harry Beck, and he was essentially almost retired electrical engineer working for the London Underground. And he decided that the other map was the problem. So in his own time, he came up with his own map, which is a bit like a circuit diagram. And he systemised the interface of the underground for the user. And people suddenly worked out, okay, I go up this straight line, I get off at that station there because the two joins are joined together, and then I go left along the blue one and off you go. And it became enormous clarity out of that. And it's now the go-to standard for every public transport map in the world, and it was designed by an electrical engineer in his spare time on the weekend by the London Underground. But the point is, that's what good urban design is too. It's where someone can go into it and they can read it instantly, they can intrinsically understand what's going on in that space and all of the parts of it and how they're working if they want to sit there and begin to analyse it. And that's a great thing. And I suppose as designers, you do that. You begin to start to analyse and break down spaces and understand what's going on. I think Harry White or someone once said one of the most important observations you can make about a public space is if people are, without alcohol or anything else, being romantic in a public place, they feel comfortable. You will not get people feeling slightly amorous or romantic in a space where there is any level of threat whatsoever. And so when you go to Europe and you see these squares and you see people sitting arm in arm and, you know, embracing each other, that's no accident. That's just because those spaces intrinsically work really well and people just feel comfortable in them. That's one of the greatest tests, I think. You won't see that happening too much in Forest Place, or in fact many of our spaces and places that we create around our cities, particularly in the Western world. So how does it all apply to regional Western Australia or regional Australia, I suppose, or even other countries? I think the challenge is to understand what is their origins. Where did they come from? And as much as that might have been 100 or 150 years ago, there's so much wrapped up in the DNA of a place that even the people could have changed and everything else around it. But if you go in there with an intervention that doesn't actually understand that, it will not work. It won't work socially. It won't work economically. It probably won't work spatially. So it's a really important thing for designers to try and have an insight into what that is. This is a photo I took of York yesterday, okay, on the way back. I was out at Bruce Rock, and I'll get to that in a minute. I went up to Mount Brown, took a shot at it. That looks like York, England, in many ways. And I suppose that's probably why they called it York. That's why the original settlers, when they went out there in 1830, they probably had a vision of it one day being a York-type city with its own cathedral and a grand main street and all those things. And to not understand that and not to understand the history of that, I think is a problem. Quite simply, in WA and in probably most of Australia, we've got sort of 4 types of regional community. We've got the Indigenous remote communities, which are, you know, often extremely remote. We have service towns. We have mining towns, which you might think they're one and the same thing. They're quite different. And then we've got all the rural small towns, of which there are literally hundreds. And all of these things, except perhaps the remote ones, Australia was built on the back of. We were an agrarian economy right the way through until probably around the 60s and 70s when mining got going. And even then, I suppose you could argue that that's not agriculture, but it's a regional contribution to our nation's economic state. And these small towns and these communities still chug away in providing enormous income for Australia and balance of payments. So why did these come about? Well, obviously in the Indigenous communities, they were pretty much focused on their basic needs. You know, they were generally around good food and water supply, and, you know, there's lots of discussion in the past about how Aboriginals were nomadic, and very few of them were. They might have been up north where the climate changed from summer to winter. But generally in the south where the food was good, they didn't. I was reading about the history of Bruce Rock this morning, a strange thing you might do. And the early explorers that went out there in 1830 came across quite established communities of brick, stone and wooden buildings out in these grass plains 300 kilometres from Perth. So they were near good, stable freshwater supplies, and there were kangaroos everywhere, and there were fish in these ponds. So, I mean, they didn't need to move around. Whereas the Europeans, they tended to go for a whole lot of reasons, strategic or otherwise, always usually starting at a coast because they arrived by a ship. And then they began to orient their communities based on transport. And so transport was always at the heart of these communities. First, as I said, it was by ship, and then we extended tracks and roads. I mean, they were literally just a track all the way between Perth and Albany, and between Fremantle and Perth, and Perth and Guildford and York. And then, obviously, later on, the railway system came in the late 1800s. And then, of course, now we've got air, which in itself changes things dramatically. So the life of a 100-year-old town, and it's pretty much the same, is that they always started off pretty much as a camp. They were always very temporary. If you look at the early photos of Perth, they were very modest, single-storey wooden buildings. Quite often in the rural areas, in Kalgoorlie and places that Kalgoorlie had a population of 120,000 people at one point, they were pretty much living in tents. But it was always laid out in a bit of a grid. Europeans get organised very quickly around that stuff. Second wave was more permanent. People felt that they were going to be permanent inland towns, and they started building first things, banks and town halls and governance structures, I suppose, and hotels popped up because we seem to respond to accommodation when there's a pub below us. There was steady growth, and they expanded out, usually in a big grid. Cars become ubiquitous around the sort of pre-war, but then post-war when they became more affordable and fuel supplies were readily available. But then we saw a dramatic change in all our rural communities everywhere through what we now call disruption. Essentially, mechanisation, large-scale mechanisation, and a bit of climate change started to happen, which meant that we had to get smarter as farmers, and we had to operate on a larger scale. We started to use pesticides, and mechanised, it didn't matter what industry, whether it was milking or timber harvesting or anything else. So resource economics, planners started to come in with zoning and shift stuff around. Unions meant that certain behaviours behaved. And of course, retailing changed quite significantly as well, from the small shop to, these country towns starting to see a Coles popping up and those sorts of things. And then we got the major disruption, I suppose, due to technology, where pretty well most of the country towns halved in size between 1990 and probably 2010, simply because the machinery, mechanisation, and even today there are literally tractors driving around by themselves. We just do not need the numbers of people that we used to. There was probably one person per 200 hectares. It's now probably one person per 3,000 hectares. That's a factor of over 10. So where we had communities with 2,000 people in them, they literally only need 200 now to do the same amount of agriculture. We have seen a slight resurgence as people got more time and more money in the cities, and they sort of had other opportunities, so they raced out into the countries, and that changed a few economies, particularly our southwest Cape, where it's now all wineries and tourism. But that was actually a really crappy sheep growing area for a long, long time, and no one could work out what to do with it. It wasn't worth much. A few people knew about surfing, and that was it. And then, by accident, we came across it was a good place to grow grapes, and the rest is history. So now, what have we got? Well, I suppose the Indigenous towns, again, they've been formalised. If you ever go out to what were originally camps, they've now got funny little houses, and they're all in a grid shape, and we good old Europeans have tried to force them into this. I think we've slowly worked that out. But they're serviced and they're connected with airfields and roads. The remote towns, I suppose, as I said, they still operate exactly as they did for the last 20, 30,000 years. They just live under structures now that are made of other materials. The service towns, I suppose the centralisation of services back to big towns like Bunbury and Kalgoorlie and Perth and Geraldton has probably changed that network of service towns out in the countryside. So a lot of the mid-tier towns are all disappeared. Mining, they were always and are still the primary employer of everything. And due to some tax changes in the early 90s, FIFO came about, which further changed them again. So that's a technological disruption, I suppose. And the rural towns, well, they are still the social and local service hub for all the farmers. But as I say, the population much reduced. So there was a recognition that something needed to happen. And so the first thing they said, well, we need some plans. We need someone to come in and fix up these towns. They need a main street and all the rest of it. And we kept saying, well, that's all good and well, but at the end of the day, we need a structure behind it for an economic structure. What's its future as a place of employment? And from then, everything else can hang on to. So royalties for regions came along. And And I suppose that raised awareness in a lot of people's minds about what was going on out in our regions. Billions of dollars were spent bringing some of these places back up to what we see as normal standards. But it also raised a bit of ire. People were saying, well, why are we wasting so much money out there when there's so few people? Well, the reason is that it's so few people, but it produces 60% of our exports. That's why we've got to reinforce it. There was a thought that somewhere along the line the regions would grow to accommodate 600,000 people, where it's currently nowhere near that. It's probably around the sort of 300,000 mark. I don't know if that'll ever happen. But they started in the Pilbara, and there's the towns, and I worked on most of those, and they have their own DNA, even though they're own mining towns. But it was all about trying to provide a place for people and give them a sense of amenity and a structure, so that whether they were there for a month, a year, or for life, they had the same opportunities, I suppose, because they never had the opportunity originally for their towns to develop the way our cities have. So where does urban design come into all this? Well, as I say, I think it's about providing a public realm, which includes facilities and interface and everything else, where people can interact and get engaged and feel part of, and I think it encourages prosperity. You very rarely see great advances in prosperity coming out of really poor urban environments. It's just something the human condition doesn't seem to permit. If people are struggling, they can't imagine themselves in a far greater place than where they are at the moment. So if urban design's the sort of physical realm between public and private space, I also see it as being this catalyst for all these other things that can happen. And in the same way people feel romantic in a really well-designed space, I think people can also aspire to greater things if they're comfortable and they can see community behaving in a normal, functional manner. So there was always the shopping list when we went out into the towns, and they also always said, you know, what do we need first? And this is pretty much what I was out doing out in Bruce Rock yesterday, is saying, well, you know, first thing we need to just do is the basics, you know, what I call hygiene factors. Like we need to reinforce the streetscape, we need trees, we need things to sit on, we need bollards to stop the four-wheel drives going wherever they want. People always wanted an entrance statement, not quite sure. I mean, you've driven for 3 hours, you're pretty sure you know you're in Bruce Rock at that point. Connectivity, I think there was a lot of structures around towns where roads didn't go. They started off as a track and then someone bitumenised it, but there was no logic to it, and so people were often driving kilometres for a very small journey otherwise. Understanding the history of the place, people always were sort of saying, well, how do we interpret some of this history? Most of which was, you know, by and large fairly dull. I mean, you know, some bloke came in, started a general store, died. Occasionally there was a murder, but you know, it's fairly benign. No one sort of conquered a disease out in these rural towns and those sorts of things. Although famous people did grow up in some of them and then leave. In the hotter parts, they were always wanting water play, you know, and then all these other things. This is a photo of South Headland, and as much as it's actually quite a glamorous bit of a structure, this is about 5 minutes after it opened. All that white paving has since become lovely brick red, because everything in Port Hedland goes brick red eventually, either just because of the general dust that flies around or the port itself. It's a baking hot space for most of the year. You know, you're pushing 120 degrees in the sun, and as far as I know, it really only gets used about once a year. So this is an example where someone's idea of good urban design and it looks pretty good on a plan and probably costs an absolute fortune, didn't achieve any of the expected outcomes. Because I don't think anyone understood the DNA of a mining town. And having a large wood-framed sort of arch, supportive, you know, protective arch for a place that never rains anyway, in a big green public square was something that the people just couldn't identify with. So if you look at service towns, the thing is they had this huge loss of character, I suppose, where it was all originally about heritage buildings and but the car just came in, and I think the thing about rural towns is it's all full of enormous amount of pragmatists as well. They just, and particularly farmers who ended up being on councils, and they just drove into town. They wanted to park out the front, drive everywhere they wanted. The other thing is that someone pointed out they'd spent the first 100 years clearing trees, so it was a little bit odd to go back into town and start planting them again. The tree for the first sort of 50, 60 years was the enemy of people in these towns. They stopped them growing things. It was a pain in the neck. So this is why this whole sort of creating a nice place in our communities is only a more recent thing in the last few decades, really. Because prior to that, those Victorian and then early boomer generations weren't interested in trees. Small psychological things, but very big impact and outcome when you're trying to catch up later. The normal things that happened was that someone would build a supermarket, so the town centre would die. It's exactly what happened in Geraldton. To get to the town centre in Geraldton, which is this street along here, you've got to drive past 3 big malls to get there. So you just generally don't, and if you do, you've done everything you need to do by the time you get there. Social change, we all know that. We sort of moved away from our streets into our backyards as the TVs got bigger and the barbecues and the pools. And with that, communities begin to dissolve because there's no meeting places. Generationally, there's also a big change as well. Victorian era people knew the benefit of clinging and working together, because without that, they would not have survived in Australia, full stop. The boomers were raised by Victorians, so they sort of understood that nexus between community coming together. And they were the ones who largely built the service clubs, the Apexes and Lions clubs and the Rotaries. They're all boomer inventions because the immediate need had disappeared, but they still saw the value of that. And those are the clubs that keep our communities, and particularly rural communities, together. But the next generation, they don't understand any of that. They don't need it. Their connectivity is via this thing, they think. And of course, they wonder why now nothing's happening in these towns. They just keep saying, council, what are you doing about it? Government, what are you doing about it? Well, government and council can't do anything about it because they're only ever community-based initiatives anyway. So these towns are actually, they're boring places because there's no community involvement in making them interesting and getting together and doing it. So as I said, you've got to sort of understand that DNA of what's happening. And this, to some extent, it's happening in our own towns. Everyone's screaming about Beaufort Street and Walcott Street and all these streets that are dying. It's because we don't support them the way previous generations did. Because we don't need to have that community interconnection that they knew they needed for that to work. So the trick is, after 30 to 40 years of what I call average or bad decisions, we have to reverse that process. And you can't do it all in a 5-year gap. It actually takes 30 or 40 years of good decisions to pull yourself back out of that hole. And to explain to people what the future needs to look like for them to have an environment that they're proud of and that they can be part of again. And that's often when you go in and do that visioning and they sit there and they have no clue, and you sort of say, well, you've got to really rethink this. You've got to turn this upside down, because otherwise there is no future for you, because what you see here is just, it's a cliff and you're going to fall off it and you're already beginning to see it. But importantly, with each town, you've got to work out what's your economic advantage. And some of it's all very much the same, it's just either cows or it's sheep or it's wheat. But for instance, Geraldton, it's actually one of the first port towns in Western Australia. It's the second after Fremantle. It was ahead of Albany as a proper port. And it has a huge fishing industry, and it's also the gateway to the Abrolhos and everything else, which is fantastic stories. So Geraldton's reimagining its future around a maritime future as opposed to being a service future for wheat growing, which it still is, but its future isn't in wheat growing. So where do we start with these in a design sense? Well, you've got to start with the main streets, and as I mentioned all that. You've got to be able to design all these things so they can self-activate it, because once we're gone and once the council changes, they still have these spaces. They've still got to work out what they do with them. And you see different attempts at that. And I suppose that sound shell in Port Hedland is someone's idea of a space that someone could self-activate. But realistically, that's not a feasible thing for a small community group to know how to use. And you've also got to understand where the economics of these places are coming. And as I said there, when you go overseas and you go to these great cities, you don't think, right, I'm in Paris, I'm just going to rip 30 k's out and check out the new mall. No, you don't. You hang around in the main streets and everything else. And that's exactly what these towns forgot. They thought that the mall investment was fantastic. Oh, brilliant, we've finally got some decent shops. Yeah, but at the expense of all your town centres. And I suppose places like Bunbury, they woke up about 20-odd years ago and started to that reinvestment process and started to do those small interventions to create those spaces that people feel a bit more comfortable in, because you can sort of see, pretty much the same bit of street, the early version or the farmer's version versus the town centre person. Mining towns are a different kettle of fish altogether because they were built purely as a remote dormitory for a mine. They're sort of modern slavery in many ways. You take these people up on a plane, dump them in a small town, they're there forever, and then you shuttle them to and from a large hole in the ground in a bus. And they didn't have a normal economy. The normal town never developed. They created often a sort of a 60s version or a 70s version of a mall, which was usually a supermarket, a pharmacy, a post office, and maybe 2 other shops, and that was it. And everything was, because pretty much all their clothing, everything was all provided by the mining company, so they didn't want for much. But of course, in the 90s and early 2000s, the mining companies gave all these towns back to local authorities and said, here you go, we don't need this town anymore because we've got FIFO, we've got all our people living out on site, here's the town. They didn't come with any plans, they had no idea where any of the services were. Most of it was pretty much end of life. So these fledgling local authorities have suddenly picked up dozens and dozens of big mining towns with thousands of people living in them, with no instruction manual, no idea what to do, no normal economy, no shops that people can even move into, and combine this with FIFO and the internet. So you can see the struggle that all these communities were having in trying to readapt these towns and create public spaces and opportunity for people to thrive and benefit and grow and stay longer than just their swing or their 4-year contract commitment with the mine. So we got involved a lot in these, and they're pretty hard nuts to crack to try and work out how to undo it. But inevitably there was always a few stories, and you could start to hang on, and there was this slow building pride about these towns, and it wasn't about the company for a change. It wasn't about, we're Rio people or we're BHP people, which tended to happen. You've got Rio operating Tom Price and Paraburdoo, and you've got BHP running Newman, and they're the main operator. But people said, well, I'm from Tom Price, and yes, I do happen to work for Rio sometimes. So there was this beginning of people getting a sense of place, and that's a really rare thing, and that's a really great thing. And so we had to try and work out what it was that we could build on that sense to enable people to feel like this was their home for however long that was. And so it just starts with the basics. We had to literally start again as if we were designing a new town. Engage with the community, start to work out how we could create a main street that gave someone some comfort and some amenity. How we reconnect these things, because everything sort of evolved with the mess and the headquarters and the head office of the mining company as the middle, and all the roads radiated outwards. It was a very sort of Roman solution, I suppose. So we had to disrupt that structure and put our own physical interventions in it to try and get people to see the spaces and places differently, and that hierarchy of space that, yes, Rio is still a predominant employer, but they're not the centre of town. They're not the head office. Council is now the head of administration and the shops and all those other things. And as I said, try and redress the sort of balance, because, up there, they're long distances and it's pretty hot, so people do use vehicles a lot. But there's also a lot of time of the year, and tourists and everyone else who don't necessarily want to just drive, 100 metres from one side of the street to the other. And promote the unique. And whilst the unique can't come from as little as 40 years of history, it can come from the nature of the place. And a lot of these towns weren't accidentally placed. If you look at where Rio put Tom Price and where BHP put Newman, they're actually in really beautiful little valleys with outstanding terrain around them. And there's not a lot of connection between the places and the surrounds around them. So it was about emphasising some of that as well and bringing it to people's attention. The small towns are another kettle of fish, and there are literally hundreds and hundreds of them in this category. I've talked to a couple. This is the one I came from. These were really decimated by technology more than most, as I mentioned. Firstly, boarding schools got better, bigger and cheaper, relatively. So a lot of the kids went away to school. Technology meant that you were buying the things that you thought you needed from the internet and turning up. And the biggest shop in any of these towns is the post office, because that's where everything comes through. Most of the services just disappeared. If it wasn't for Bendigo Bank, there would be no banks anywhere. You would have to do it all online. And we even see drive-in, drive-out, the influence of Dido, where football teams on the weekend are actually being filled up by Perth players driving down in carloads of 4, playing footy for $200 a head and then driving back to Perth just so the town can have a team in the competition. So that whole Dido thing, that transition thing changed. And so sports declines, and sport was always the middle section of all this, and with that rate base and a whole lot. And so these towns are in absolute, a real dire chance of just disappearing altogether. And then suddenly there's millions and millions of square kilometres of farmers with no ability to have any connection point. And so we needed to work out, and some towns have done it better than others, about what to do. So sort of Coolin came up with this idea that it just needed to have 1 or 2 key things on the calendar that pulled them all together, and they'd see where that went. And so they came up with this thing called the Coolin Bush Races, which incidentally was on our old farm. And that came about because as kids we used to get on horses and race around this old rock. And someone said, well, that was a bit of fun. And so they ran the local race, and about 500 people turned up. And then the following year, 1,000 people turned up. Now they have 5,000 people turn up. And they all camp, and it's the best sort of interim campground you'll find anywhere. Hot showers, toilets for 5,000 people. It's incredible. Racetrack, absolutely farcical horse races, the funniest thing you'll ever see. But it has put them on the map, and it made so much money, but the community effort to deliver that is huge. An old farmer died, and he didn't have any kids, so he left the town the money, a couple of $1 million. This is a long time ago. And they couldn't work out what to do with it. So a bunch of farmers drove to Queensland, bought a water slide and trucked it back themselves and erected it next to the pool. That's now the biggest thing, tallest thing in the wheat belt, taller than all the silos out there, I think, and draws in people for, 100 kilometres during summer months. They've regraded, they've changed the whole townscape back to what it was probably looked like in the landscaping off the main street. That was just a gravel pit. Out to the race courses, this thing called the Tin Horse Highway, so all the farmers get involved. And now they have, the Burning Swan, which is, the actually licensed, the West Australian version of the Burning Man Festival out of the United States. And that is beginning to attract an entirely different generation who can see the benefits of the community. I don't know if anyone has actually been to it. It's a pretty interesting weekend, I gather. Usually terrible weather, but it doesn't seem to influence anyone. And perhaps next time you go to it, you'll drive through Coolin and get an idea of the town it is. As I say, I was out at Bruce Rock yesterday, and it's got the similar issues, but it's a slightly stronger town. And one of the things that struck me about how do you get people to reinvest in their own town? And one of the things is that previous generations were given advice by locals. So if you were a farmer, you had some money, you went into the bank manager and he said, you should buy some property, and that one down the street there with a shop on it, you should buy that. Of course, they get their advice from Perth people now who say, don't invest in your town. That's the surest way to lose money. Invest it in an apartment in South Perth. And so the entire generational shift of the people making investment decision now has changed. And so trying to encourage locals to invest locally, that's a really hard thing to do because all their professional advice is saying something else, indeed. Same with the social values I mentioned about the difference between the Victorian era, the boomers, and perhaps now the Gen Ys and things who are running those big farms. And they're big operations. A lot of these guys are investing a couple of $1 million in putting in crops. So they're not playing at it. There's a lot of money at stake in doing this. And what is the role of government? It's become very paternalistic. We have expected that, so that's what they've become. We talk to council, we talk to our local member, fix this problem for us. We want you to do this. We don't do anything ourselves anymore. So, and as a result, volunteerism is right down. There's no club committees anymore. No one wants to do any of this work that you need to build a community. And people connect through Wi-Fi and everything else and through the internet and not physically. So how do you turn a town around when it's facing those huge structural changes? And I think that's going to be the challenge, I think, for all these places is find out what it is, the one thing that's going to work for your town or your community, and then build on it. A couple have had more success than others. This is Donnybrook, where they looked after the locals. First and foremost, the town got together and said, what do we need? And they said, oh, look, there's just not much here for the families to do. If they can't go and play in the pub when Dad's there, so what are we going to do? So they built this playground. And the kids started going down there, so they extended it. This thing is now about 250 metres long. There's no way you can drive through Donnybrook with a kid in your car and not stop. It just goes on and on and on, this playground. It is absolutely massive. And as a result, they started the tourism is there, and families drive out from Bunbury to Donnybrook for lunch. And look, it's just a small thing, but it's growing. And it started by looking after the locals. They also fixed up their main street. That is Albany Highway on the right, or not Albany Highway, the South West Highway. So that has logging trucks and everything else. But main roads had to suck it up and change their idea about what a road should look like so that they could turn their main street into a main street, even though it has logging trucks all the way through it and road trains. They just have to slow down. So again, it's the small changes, the small things, things that they can see that early success in, that involve the community. Went out to Morawa, another one of these wheat belt towns, wanted some change, some structure, some hope. Often what I find with these things is it takes one half good leader out there, and that's about as much as you need, as much as anything else. I would much rather have a great Shire president than $5 million, because you can have $5 million and waste it all, and a year later have nothing changed. You get one great Shire president, and he will change everything for the next 10 years. These are sort of place-based things that we always use, which is you triangulate your activities. If you've got 3 things out of this town working, don't put them all over the place, which is what they typically do. Country towns tend to think that everything needs to hang off their Anzac Memorial, which really every town has an Anzac Memorial because, yes, they all lost people in the wars, but it's not a tourist attraction. And it's certainly, and sort of celebrating past lives and death isn't something that families get too excited about. So you've got to almost say, well, that's good, that'll happen, that's something that'll happen on Anzac Day, and there'll be a ceremony around that. But really, this is about the future and life. So what are the things that are going to work and separate them out from memorials in the past? And fill up those spaces. And even this was just a bunch of shade shelters that gave a bit of a walk between one end of the town and the other on the other side, because, like all these towns, they have a railway line down the middle that's no longer used. So it's a one-sided town. And how do you fill up those enormous spaces? And they sort of started planting perennials and things. So at least during the touristy months, there's flowers and all the rest of it. Up in the northwest, it's fairly different again. But again, it's very much about trying to capture the things that people value, I suppose. So I suppose at the end of it, all of these learnings come down to, as I mentioned before, you've got to look after the locals first. No good building a giant tourist attraction like a giant ram or, out in Bruce Rock. Wally Foreman, a famous sports commentator, came from Bruce Rock. We're not going to go and build a giant Wally out there because that's not for the locals. That would be a tourist thing. That wouldn't work. It has to be a campaign. People have to get and want to be involved in this. If they're not activated in this, it's not going to work. As I mentioned, it's got to be it's got to be a different future. You can talk about the past, but it's completely irrelevant. You cannot have a town that's based on something that used to happen 100 years ago. And communities are going to be completely different. And I think focusing on a few things will make it really unique. Onslow has this really weird grey nomad attraction whereby the local caravan park guy at the beginning of every year plants with seeds a couple of thousand cherry tomato plants. And the climate up there means they just grow, like they'll grow a metre tall in about 3 weeks. And grey nomads come from everywhere to get the free cherry tomatoes. They're a funny lot. If there's something free anywhere, they'll drive, use 1,000 litres of diesel to get the free thing. I'm not kidding. And so it's only a small thing, but everyone resonates with it. If you ever speak to any grey nomad, they'll tell you about the free cherry tomatoes in Onslow. So how do we build on that? So what are the other easy, cheap, free things that we can start planting? So they built a big community garden, actually, and it was a fairly good involvement for the locals. There's a couple of local language groups in town. They don't always get along very well. They chuck stuff at each other. So they decided to get them in the middle and build a community garden that they could own. And it got bigger and bigger, and now they sell stuff to the caravanners. And, it's the little things, and it's given them an enormous amount of pride. And it's actually brought that bit of community together. And it's probably the best bit of design space in the whole of the town, to be honest, because it's got a barbecue and a pizza oven and this fantastic garden, and everyone respects it. It's one of the few things that gets respected in that town. I think one of the things I always talk about as a design thing is just balance. Just stand and look. The next time you go into a town, just stand and look at the proportions of things. what's the balance between people and cars? You know, I was standing in Bruce Rock, and from shop front to the other side of the road was 48 metres of bitumen. That's actually wide enough to land a jumbo jet. We don't, you know, at the most they have about 2 cars in town at any one time. So where's the balance in that? Bitumen versus grass. You can't always use grass everywhere because of the cost and maintenance, but there's other things you can use these days. And in a lot of these wheatfield towns, I'm going to be encouraging them to just mass seed wildflowers on all these gravel pit areas because they'll grow, and for about 4 months of the year there'll just be this massive carpet of wildflowers. Then I can mow them all, it doesn't matter. It's just fallow land anyway, but it'll become a tourist attraction in itself. How do you, in the bigger towns, how do you balance out housing versus retail? I mean, there's always this thing where everyone wants more and more retail. The reality is you can only have a certain amount. You need to get in more housing and less retail. And where you've got too much space, how do you then activate parts of that space? And don't expect to be able to activate all of it. It just can't happen. And don't be afraid to really restructure towns. You know, talk to people about changing the way people perceive it and operate it and use it, because the way it is now suited a function that was probably 100 years old, started 100 years ago, and probably has no future and no function around doing that. The South Headland Town Centre is a perfect example of that, where they had originally was going to be development land and it became a public open space, and someone said that looks great on plan, but it's just not. They just do not need a hectare of grass and gravel right next to a closed box shopping centre in the middle of a town where most of the time people are, you know, pretty much trying to get out of the sun because it's just so hot. So yeah, really restructure that, change land uses around over time, which you can generally do. Do not ever listen to someone say you can't do that or apply a rule. Just what we do is we do pilot programs. Everything's a pilot, and if it works, it'll work. If it doesn't, doesn't matter. You tried. But importantly, and I think for most of these things, it's about trying to get them to buy into a vision. And if you ever read a vision for a local community, it's all a bit the same, you know. Be fairly bold in the words around that and what people aspire it to be, and then and make the words something that they think they can actually achieve. Because if you start using words like sustainability and you know, collaboration, and who can aspire? I can't be sustainable in a community sense. I don't know what that means, you know. So yeah, really try and frame it around things that they can aspire to and reach and touch, and give them some examples of where it's worked and some guidance about how to go about that process, which we do. And as designers, we always are very tempted, and so a lot of the community and so a lot of council people, very quick to rush to spatial and design solutions. And as architects, you'll imagine that a new key building is going to solve a lot of problems. It won't, I'm sorry to say. It might solve one problem, which is great, but it's not going to solve all of them. So you do have to think in all these other ways about social and economic change as well, and how they fit together. You know, it's just a series of circles, and the Venn diagram bit between social, economic and spatial is the bit in the middle is urban design. And that's how it works. Because, as I said, you know, everyone wants a town square, everyone wants a plaza. No one knows what to do with them. What's the point? There's no social and economic benefit to a plaza, but spatially I've delivered an outcome that everyone should be proud of, except they don't. Albany, I don't know if you've been there lately, they've decided they wanted a town square on their main street. I think the jury's out as to really what it achieves. It's formalised a formerly unused space, but as far as I can see, it has no specific obvious function other than once a year when they might gather as a community to, you know, cut a ribbon on something. But it is not activated, it's not connected, it's very expensive. As William White says, you know, it's amazing how many of the great spaces in the world that we've created that are completely and utterly unusable. It shouldn't be that hard, but it seems it really is. The other one I think about is the intergenerational attractiveness. We, as designers, tend to think of what we need, and it's hard to put yourself in the minds of the next generations, because really that's who's going to be using it. And also make it inclusive. You know, I think we're really good at being exclusive about what we do, and I think we need to be much more inclusive about stuff. You know, this is my design, and it has to look like this because I've seen other things that have influenced that design, and I want it to represent me, and how I feel about the place, that's death from a designer's point of view, because that's not your job. Your job is there to provide for everyone in every context, and it's not about you at all. But be very deliberate, because what you're imposing on this town is the next layer of history. It's what people will look back on and say, that was good, that was great, or that was a waste of money. Because I can drive through any town, any community around Perth, any main street and go, that was a waste of money. It never worked. And someone won't put their name to that. Architects, it'd be great if their company name was on the front of every building, I can assure you. There'd be quite different outcomes. Because there's no ownership when it doesn't work. But when it's great, they'll all race around saying, I've got an award. And so you have to be really deliberate about this stuff. It's not accidental. As designers, we do have the ability to influence a lot of people's lives over a long time frame. And that sounds like a big, heavy thing to bear, but it's not actually. It's actually an enormous privilege. And you should grasp that opportunity as young people and think, how can I be part of that privileged position that I've been put in? So really, that's all I've got to say. Any questions? Yeah?
Do you believe that WA needs another major city? And if so, what do you believe it would take?
WA will get another major city when there's an economic driver to have one. You can't just put people somewhere. Someone came up with this thing and they found a beautiful little spot of land up near the Ord River. And there's no doubt about Lake Argyle and the Ord River Dam is an amazing climate and place, and it's livable and everything else, but there's nothing there for anyone to do. So why would you go there? Yeah, and so, Kalgoorlie was going to be a huge inland town, over 100,000 people. It had 30 breweries. It was incredible. But as soon as the resource disappeared, and the main super pit is pretty much out of gold in the next 10 years, what's Kalgoorlie going to be? 30,000 people there. It's a fair bet that's going to be down to less than 20 within a couple of decades. So it just needs an economic driver, and I can't see one on the horizon anywhere. The mining guys have worked out how to do what they need to do, which is logistics, really. They just dig a hole and shift a product from here to here to here without people. There's no reason to live there. So, and governments have in the past, and we've done things like Canberra, but I don't know, that's sort of a one-off really, isn't it? Yeah. And if you go to Canberra, it pretty well exists only because of that one pointy building on the hill. There's no other reason it would be there otherwise. It's a good place to put them though. It's bloody hot in summer and freezing in winter. Yeah. Sorry, yep. Yeah.
So how much, with designs of rural places, how much political influence could a design have in a rural town?
I've only ever encountered it when we had really good political influence, and that was a game changer where they got things done. Generally, by the time we get involved or they're pretty keen to see some changes and some outcomes, and so you very rarely hear the word no. If you come up with an idea and it's got half a chance of being funded in some way or implemented, they're all over it as best they can anyway, their abilities. People are quite siloed in their lifestyle out there as well. They're a bit they're connected to the world through their TV, but really they live it's a pretty small circle. So you sort of come in with new ideas and new things. I've yet to have a discussion with someone where I couldn't really explain to them the benefits of how that could come about as a result of a particular way forward. And really, if as a result of a consultant team we came up with something that was a bit out there and didn't work, then they're probably right. The pub test is still pretty valid, I reckon. Yeah. Yeah.
So you talked about interconnectivity. In previous generations where people were connected because they had a common goal to achieve. There was the source of connection, whereas in the current generation, it's more everything is moved towards the digital world. How do you reconnect people like the current generation? How do you see or envisage it through architecture?
Yeah, look, I think there's less reliance on, for the pure point of connecting people, there's probably less reliance on architecture than you imagine. It doesn't mean that a really beautifully designed building wouldn't achieve a better outcome. I agree that is an opportunity. But you know yourself, when you meet your friends, you don't think, oh, I need to go to an inspiring place so that we can have a chat. You just go to a logical place where you can all get to and you feel comfortable and it meets your immediate needs, which is either a drink or a bit of food or a bit of shelter or an IT system or whatever else. So that's what architecture is. It's just providing, the shell of an environment so that people can do what they need to do as humans. And so in rural communities particularly, in the past they built things that were solid and big and structural, and that was the Victorians' way of saying, we've survived death and we're going to persist, and we build these big things and we will continue to persist. They didn't need to. I'm sort of glad they did, because if these towns were just all weatherboard, they wouldn't be there by now. In fact, a lot of them have disappeared. So in terms of the role of architecture in connecting people, again, it's more about the use and the reason for it, and if the architecture can then assist that even further, great. And that's why I think multi-function spaces are becoming much more applicable in communities, because the specific one-use need, like a CWA hall or something or other, is not, you just can't justify it economically. And so sort of community hub buildings become the centre of all these things. School buildings are becoming the town centre, the hub for these things. In the mining towns, the TAFEs and things become the hubs of activity and connectivity in many ways. Yeah, don't know if that answers your question particularly.
Yeah, and one more question afterwards. Is that
Yeah.
okay if I ask the second question?
Yeah.
So in terms of spaces where previously people were living in houses, for example, if you look at the houses, the use of the space has transferred to the new generation because we are living more in digital world, as we discussed just now. Do you think we need to rethink of how we design space in terms of dwellings and other spaces as well, or no?
Spaces? I think management of, like technology in the digital realm, for me, unless we get into the sort of hyper reality of digital walls and all this sort of stuff, which we're not quite there yet. For me, I think it's about managing it as part of your life. I don't think it is your life. Anyone who lives in some digital realm, they're not the normal people. Most of us just go about life the way we normally do. I was having a visioning discussion with someone the other day, and they said, we've got to envision what we're going to be in 30 years. And I said, well, what were we doing in 1990? Because I tell you what, it hasn't changed much. Yeah, we got this thing, and that has begun to transform the world. The iPhone and the apps and the retail economy is beginning to change the structure of our towns and our cities. But generally, I still get up, run around the block, have breakfast, get in the car, drive to work all day, drive home. None of that's changed in 30 years. The next 30, maybe, maybe the Moore's law of digital growth will absolutely transform our society. I don't know. It's hard to say. I don't know if we need to be somehow or other trying to envisage what our dwellings will look like to accommodate a digital future.
I meant in terms of, because previously we didn't have the time, we didn't spend as much time using our phones, rather we interacted inside the house. When I'm talking about living in this world, I don't mean literally, but rather more in terms of the time that we spend in the digital world, as in on our phones and stuff. Isn't that affecting our the way we interact with spaces around us a lot?
I think it's just impacting on how we interact with other people. I don't know about spaces. I mean, I think when you're interacting with your digital thing, you could be anywhere, and it doesn't matter what you're in. I mean, I know that the technology with big screens and things is going to change that as well, but I think that's something we need personally as a society. We need to sort of manage as opposed to let it control us. Otherwise, it all gets pretty weird, I think. Yeah, I'm just an old person talking there. Yeah.
Just about with regards to obviously there's a lot of economic input to how little towns work in regards to community spirit and stuff like that. But have you seen any projects that you feel might have had a really strong influence outside of the economic input? That might have been really successful.
Yeah, look, there are some small towns that have turned their future around by being systematic and deliberate and not giving up. Absolutely. I mean, there are some communities that, as a result of again, key individuals, I think, who've through good succession also have managed to not go the way of other communities. And I think they are quite inspiration to other towns as to how things can be different. But again, there's a lot of luck in that too. It's about getting, like some of these towns like Bruce Rock, for instance, it's a nice little town. It could work quite well. They get 3 years of drought. Any idea that you might have had about transforming a community and all the rest of it, it gets really hard when there's absolutely no money for 3 years, So there is a lot of luck in that as well. I mean, I think the towns that are developing in our Cape, through to Bustleton all the way down through Margs and all the rest of it, are getting a more consistent income coming through because of the diversification of their economies. And so I suppose in many ways they're proving the opposite of a lot of other regional towns. But that's a bit of luck. I mean, there was just a Department of Agriculture guy that went down to Margaret River, decided it was a good place to grow olives and worked out that grapes grew better. Told a few people and a doctor put some in and off they went. I mean, it's just luck, really. We might have got there eventually, but and who knew that we're going to be really good at it too, and who knew that it was going to bring in millions of dollars of investment and that rich guys in Perth wanted to spend their money down there, So until then, everyone was going to York for their holidays. York was the place where all the wealthy went and bought farms on the weekends, and then they all went down south. So York missed out. Bit of luck. So yeah, some towns have done really well by comparison, but it's been a fair bit of luck, but it's also been just a long road, yeah, for sure. And I think it's the same with the communities in our city. If you look at a couple of the sort of main streets and communities that are doing quite well and thriving, like Eastwick Parkham, for instance, that's because there's been this really diligent community that's been pushing away at trying to achieve this for a long time and actually hasn't given up and not taken anything for granted along the way. Whereas you look at some of the other places and, yeah, they're really being beat up by this digital economy that's transforming retail and entertainment.
I just had probably the last question because we're running out of time.
Sure.
Have you heard any discussion in these towns about rare earth